Famous Pianists and Their Technique, Chapter 1, The Meaning of Technique. Summary by Laura Aguirre. Chapter 1 begins with a quote from Nadia Boulanger. She was a 20th century composer, teacher, conductor, and scholar. I found a website here with some more information on her and a picture of her as well. Here's a quote that the chapter starts off with. Music is technique. It is the only aspect of music we can control. One can only be free if the essential technique of one's art has been completely mastered. This is Ms. Boulanger talking about how if you have technique, that's the most important thing, and then I would presume she also means everything else comes afterward. And as the chapter continues, there's different quotes from different pianists that agree, and also some that say, hey, technique isn't the one important thing. But it does say here that without proper technique, you can't have meaningful interpretation. There cannot be a truly great performance without a masterful physical technique. Is that true? Is that not true? Is it different for everybody? We'll see as the chapter proceeds. This chapter continues with other descriptions and definitions of technique from other pianists and pedagogues. Here we have Tobias Mattei, not sure how to say his name. He's a 20th century English pianist, composer, and teacher. And here he states that technique means the power of expressing oneself musically. Technique is rather a matter of the mind than of the fingers. To acquire technique therefore implies that you must induce and enforce a particular mental muscular association and cooperation for every possible musical effect. So he's saying it's a combination here of mental and actual physical movement. And I'm sure we'll hear more about him later in the book. I've also provided some websites here, and this is where I acquired his picture. Next we have Joseph Hoffman, a Polish pianist, teacher, and composer. Here he states that technique represents the material side of art, as money represents the material side of life. By all means, achieve a fine technique, but do not dream that you will be artistically happy with this alone. I guess here implying that there's more to music than just having a good technique. He continues with, the mere possession of the tools means nothing. It is the instinct, the artistic intuition as to when and how to use tools that counts. So he goes on to describe a drawer full of tools. If you have a job that needs to be done, you don't need to use every single tool in the drawer. Same thing with technique. You kind of pick and choose when you need to use a specific technique for a passage or a certain articulation or of that matter in the music. So there's more to it than just the tools, but the tools are important. Ferruccio Busoni, an Italian composer, pianist, conductor, and teacher. He says here that no, technique is not and never will be the alpha and omega of pianoforte playing any more than it is with any other art. And he says that there should be various conditions, various things that need to be fulfilled in order to make a great artist. Technique, perfect in and for itself, may be found in any well-constructed pianola. Nevertheless, a great pianist must first of all be a great technician. But technique, which constitutes only a part of the art of the pianist, does not lie merely on fingers and wrists or in strength and endurance. So this is kind of nice here. He's saying, of course, it's important, but I think he wants to balance everything else out, perhaps musicality and other things that I'm sure the chapters will get into later. So here's somebody that kind of differed from some of the other quotes that we've heard so far. Next we have two pianists. I was unable to find pictures of them, so I'm just going to read their quotes. Thomas Fielden, technique can be defined as the acquired skill in physical craft which an artist brings to bear in expressing his own spiritual individuality. Sidney Harrison says, I am satisfied that we cannot make a sharp division between technique and interpretation. As the technique gains in command and confidence, it actually seems to prompt the imagination of bolder and bolder flights. Based off of these two quotes, I can gather that they're basically saying if you are schooled in proper technique, then that will allow you to take more liberty with your musical expression and explorative interpretation. Here is Iranian-born Armenian violinist and teacher Ivan Galamian, and he starts off by saying kind of what the other pianists were saying, that it's a mentally and a physical thing to have good technique. But he also includes here that it is complete mastery over all of the potentialities of the instrument that also help for the musician to have a good performance. And this is so true for pianists, well, all of musicians really, but for pianists because we don't get to carry around our own piano to perform. You know, a lot of times we have to play on whatever instrument is there in the recital hall or at what church you're at, whatever the case may be. But you have to have good technique first within yourself physically, and then know how the instrument reacts or responds to your physical touch. Your reliability and control, he says here, once you have good reliability and control of your own technique, that opens up the opportunity for more imaginative playing, more interpretive playing. And he's calling this accomplished interpretive technique. It is the fundamental goal for which one must strive because it and it alone opens the way to the highest artistic accomplishment. He continues in the next paragraph, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, about having naturalness. Naturalness is a guiding principle for also having a good performance and having good technique. So what is the natural way? Well, in the past, it states here on page 3 that many famous pianists and theorists have not agreed on a technique that is 100% correct for all. And that's kind of the idea that someone would say, this is the right way and the only way, yet what works for one pianist might not work for the other, and then the music sounds beautiful either way. And this kind of goes back to Galimian, how he was talking about naturalness, that it should be the first guiding principle, and that right, quote unquote here, is only what is natural for the particular student, for only what is natural is comfortable and efficient. And that kind of goes true too. If the pianist is physically comfortable, the music is also going to kind of exude that. There have been also unnatural technical theories that did not last, and probably for obvious reasons, where maybe a pianist ended up hurting their fingers or getting carpal tunnel syndrome, I would imagine. But there's also been valid piano techniques that say that it does include naturalness, and it was discovered by instinct. This makes me think that maybe certain people are born with a more natural ability to play an instrument, kind of like dancing, where they just can do it so easily and flawlessly without thinking about it. Perhaps same thing with an instrument. I've encountered many students that just look natural sitting at the piano, as weird as that may sound, and others that look completely awkward no matter how I tell them to sit and place their hands. So that is also quite interesting. So we're learning from this historical study so that present day pianists can kind of learn about this natural principle. And here at the bottom of page 3, it says, surely more than one system has effectively presented technical truth, and no one method holds a patent right to truth. There are two categories that help to demonstrate piano technical knowledge, and one of them is the empirical approach, and this is based on experience. The book here is stating that Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, and Liszt are considered empiricists, and rightly so. Much of their music, not all of it, is written very well for the pianist because they themselves were in fact pianists in real life. They knew how to write for the instrument, they knew how to move around the instrument. Leon Fleischer here is quoted saying, it's your musical ideas that form or decide for you what kind of technique you are going to use. In other words, if you are trying to get a certain sound, you just experiment around to find the movement that will get you this sound. That is technique. And he uses the word experiment. Going back to Mozart and Beethoven, Chopin, and Liszt, they were also experimenting with the instrument and its evolution and trying to get different sounds and writing different kind of music. So it goes back to the experience. They were experienced musicians and they were experimenting. That's how they became so good with their technique. Horowitz describes or says here that he's not able to explain how he attained such good technique. It was probably something for him that just came natural. He just used purely musical approaches to get what he wanted. He was thinking of musicality, I would presume, more so than technique. There's a story here that Mussorgsky tells where he's not that great with technique, that he's actually poor at technique and that it must bog down the brain. And he gives an example of going to a restaurant and eating the pie, but then the hostess comes out and starts talking about all the stuff in the kitchen about butter and 500 eggs and cabbages, and all of a sudden the pie doesn't taste that good anymore because she's giving all these details about something that it has nothing to do with the pie. In other words, it's no longer enjoyable because you're being bombarded with all this other stuff. Hence, that's what I think he thinks technique is. If you overdo it, all of a sudden the flavor of the music disappears. And then lastly, we have Ernest Bacon, and he talks about that science can also confuse the art. If you're so concerned with the anatomy, the neurology, the mechanics of your arms and your hands and stuff while you're performing, that kind of takes away from the art. He says here, piano playing will never be a science. If it were, it would cease to be an art, which is true. If we end up talking too much about the science of it, it becomes quite mechanic instead of musical. The second category of technical piano knowledge is constructed on the analytical approach. This is based off of logical reasoning. Arnold Schultz, a pianist and author, talks about scientific curiosity and the subjective sensibility, that both are valid and can be complementary. Here in the last bit of this chapter, he mentions a couple of artists who are also scientists. Here I posted about Leonardo da Vinci, who of course we know as a sculptor and painter, but he was also an engineer. And we need to mention Johann Sebastian Bach and his discovery of equal temperament, which was a major scientific contribution to music. The chapter kind of concludes here with a statement from Schultz that it would be a folly to assume that the creativeness of these men was impaired by their scientific activity. It would be only open-mindedness to assume that they were the better artists for it. Now that we've had this introduction on empirical and analytical technique, the following chapters will illustrate how these methods can work together to create an outstanding pianist.